friends and family!
Welcome back!
Welcome back! We are finally back to recording.
It's been a while, we know.
Yeah, it's been a minute. We needed a little bit of a break for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
That's just kind of how life goes, though, you know?
Yeah.
Things happen, or you're busy.
Yep.
Other stuff just kind of goes by the wayside. But it's out now. So.
Yeah. Have fun.
You know.
I'm assuming you need a little bit of a recap on the last chapter?
Well, I don't remember anything that happened in the last chapter, so
Alright,
yeah.
Cool. Well, it's pretty straightforward, so it shouldn't take too long. Izzy, Birdie, and Sam went on a field trip. And do you remember where they went?
Yes, they went to Atlantis, right?
Yeah, they did. So yeah, they went to visit Birdie's old mentor, Taya, who took them on a tour around Atlantis.
Right.
Yeah, and then they went to a restaurant for food. I can't remember if it was lunch or dinner, which honestly doesn't really matter that much anyway.
Dinner, wasn't it?
And while at the restaurant, Izzy gets a phone call from her dad.
Yeah.
Clement Kingsley.
Mm-hmm.
And
that was a lot.
that didn't go super well, yeah.
Yeah.
So to unwind, she steals a bottle of vodka and meets a pretty girl.
Hey.
Yeah. A little Miss Lola.
Lola, that's her name, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, we left off. They were going back to Taya's apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's where we're picking up.
Sweet.
Sick.
And Tulsa is going to be reading today. I've read the past 2, maybe 3.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
She's gonna take the reins.
It'll be fun. Okie dokie. So this is chapter 6. The date.
The date.
Boris the Orca had dropped his passengers a block away from their destination, leaving the Ravens and their tour guide with a 10-minute swim ahead of them. Izzy greatly appreciated the opportunity to speak with Sam alone, though. She grabbed their arm and held them both back until Birdie and her old mentor were far enough ahead that they were out of earshot of the teens. What did Clement say? Sam asked at once, assuming that this was what Izzy wanted to talk about. They weren't entirely wrong, but Izzy had another agenda too. Still, she gladly seized the opportunity to vent about her stupid know-it-all father. Oh, you know, the usual, Izzy replied with a sigh. How are you? Your grandmother's a liar? You're a disappointment to the family? She hesitated and frowned. Well, maybe not that last one, but that was the gist of it. Sam made a sympathetic grimace. What a dick. It's whatever, Izzy shrugged with an air of indifference, but then she turned a bright pair of eyes to her cousin. On a lighter note, though, I just met someone who invited us to a party tonight. Us? Sam repeated, their eyebrows flying up in alarm. I don't do parties, Iz. Oh, come on. A little socializing could be good for you. No way. A drink here and there, sure. Maybe even a joint or two. But no parties. Not even a tiny one? Izzy begged, letting her eyes fill with desperation. She didn't actually know if the party would be tiny or not, but she knew that she wanted Sam to be there with her. Izzy had no plans on ever admitting this, but right now, Sam was her closest and only friend. No, Sam repeated stubbornly. But I'm your favorite cousin, Izzy tried to reason. No, not even for my only cousin I'm on speaking terms with. Parties are the worst combination of all of my least favorite things. People, socializing. Sam raised their hand to count their least favorite things on their fingers, but fell short after just those 2. Izzy sighed. She'd gotten the message. Fine, she yielded. Can you at least help me convince Birdie to let me go? She won't stop you, Sam replied at once, their face drawing into a confused frown. She won't? Izzy almost shouted the question. She was so used to having to hide her partying from various overbearing grown-ups and parents that the idea of Birdie actually being okay with it was totally insane. Dude, partying and drinking is like average witch stuff, Sam snorted amusedly. Our ancestors literally invented at least half of the liquors you drink on a weekly basis. They paused, glancing at their cousin. I mean, I assume. That's probably accurate, Izzy conceded with a shrug, quickly summing up the number of drinks she usually had in a week. Then she quickly refocused her mind. But so you're seriously telling me that if I go to Birdie and tell her that I've been invited to a party that I really, really want to go to, she'll be thrilled, Sam stated in a tone of confidence. Actually, she'll probably force you to go just so you can mingle with the local youths. You know, to observe them and their magical habits. Just ask her when we get back and you'll see. And that is exactly what Izzy did. She was still a little concerned that Sam had overestimated Bertie's coolness and that the old woman would explode on her like Clement had done so many times. But once they'd all returned to the apartment, Izzy swallowed her nerves and approached her grandmother. She caught Bertie alone in a hallway just as she came out of the restroom, causing the poor little raven lady to jump high in surprise. Well, she jerked sideways and drifted vaguely upward before catching herself and flailing her arms to level out in the water. Just as Sam had predicted, Bertie was thrilled that Izzy had been invited to a party and wasted no time in telling her to enjoy herself and to make lots of friends. But Izzy thought she could see a hint of disappointment in those crinkly eyes. It was clear that a small part of Bertie wished that Izzy would stay and get on Taya's good side. But Izzy was desperate for a good night out. She'd been working her ass off for the past week and a half, and then that conversation with Clement back at the restaurant. Taya was interesting and all, but Izzy thought she'd already learned plenty of stuff about Atlantis by now. She thus ignored the clump of guilt in her throat and gave her grandmother a big hug as thanks. When they both returned to join Sam and Taya in the living room, Bertie briefly explained the situation and informed Taya that Izzy would need to leave early. Meanwhile, Izzy immediately fished her phone up and texted Lola the good news. Her heart fluttered excitedly when she felt her phone buzz barely 2 minutes later. "That's awesome," Lola replied with an excessive number of exclamation points. "Meet me at the King Triton statue downtown in 2 hours." Relaying the information to the group of curious onlookers, Izzy was relieved to hear that the statue in question was located just a few blocks away and would take less than 10 minutes to reach. This gave the group plenty of time to socialize some more before Izzy would need to head out, but Izzy still noted the time and set a mental timer for 1 hour and 45 minutes. She then leaned back in the plush armchair she was once again sharing with Sam, grinning broadly in anticipation of the party as her mind came up with a variety of scenarios of how the night would play out. Over the next half hour, Izzy struggled to pay attention to their conversations. When Taya offered her company a drink, Izzy almost passed up on the offer because she thought Taya had asked if she'd like to play gin rummy. That's when Izzy shook herself out of her daze and decided to be more present for the last hour or so. It was the least she could do for her beloved grandmother, and the two old ladies did have some great stories to tell. So, while her hands held on to the little glass of burgundy liquor that Taya had given her, Izzy's brain got to work actively listening. Fortunately, Taya and Bertie were excellent storytellers, and it didn't take long for Izzy to be too wrapped up in stories from the past to even notice the minutes ticking by. She thoroughly enjoyed hearing about Taya and Bertie's youth, and it was encouraging to hear that even these two old ladies had gotten into a fair amount of trouble in their youth. One particularly interesting story took place in the 1930s and involved Bertie, Taya, and Tom sneaking into a mortal speakeasy in New Orleans and subsequently getting thrown out when they got too rowdy. As it turned out, even illicit speakeasy owners tend to get upset when their patrons accidentally set the bar on fire. When 7 o'clock at last rolled around and it was time for Izzy to head out, she was seriously starting to doubt her earlier decision. For the first time ever, Izzy was having plenty of fun with her family members, and she desperately wanted to know more about all of the crazy things Bertie had done as a young witch, not to mention the many exotic places Taya had visited in her enigmatic lifetime. However, these doubts were abruptly suffocated when Izzy received a text from Lola with a picture showing what she would be wearing to the party. Her heart made a kick jump in her chest, and suddenly Izzy was antsy to get going. She got up from her and Sam's armchair, thanked Taya for a wonderful day, and promised Bertie that she would be back by 10:30 so that they wouldn't miss the vortex that would bring them back home. Taya and Bertie both followed Izzy to the door and waved her off, shouting various encouragements into the dark night as Izzy headed out. Sam remained seated, arguing that Izzy was a big girl and should be able to find the front door on her own by now. As she swam toward the King Triton statue, Izzy pulled anxiously at her clothing. She wished that she was wearing anything other than the jeans, tank top, and flannel shirt she'd been sporting all day. She wanted something that would be worthy of as cute of a girl as Lola, but it was too late to do anything about that now. Lola, on the other hand, didn't seem to care one way or another. She greeted Izzy with a wide smile, looking like a movie star in a little black dress that flowed like burnt flower petals around her legs. Even though Izzy had already seen the outfit in Lola's text earlier, It still caught her slightly off guard as she swam up to the big bronze statue to meet her date. Izzy had always had a soft spot for attractive girls in pretty dresses. "Hey, stranger," Lola greeted her cheerfully, and she pulled Izzy into a familiar hug. "How was the rest of your day?" "Not too bad," Izzy replied with a nervous smile. "Sorry to be so underdressed, by the way. I didn't bring a change of clothes." "Are you kidding?" Lola laughed, regarding Izzy as if she was wearing a suit fancy enough for the Oscars. "You look great. Now let's get going before they run out of drinks." Without waiting for a response, Lola grabbed Izzy's hand and swam toward the bottom of the city. They were far from alone down here, and Izzy realized that this was probably the late-night scene of Atlantis. Earlier during her tour of the city, this bottom tier had been as deserted as Times Square in the early hours of the morning, but now the ocean floor was crowded with Atlanteans sporting the latest and greatest in ocean fashion. The two witches swam on for a few blocks until Lola pointed to a door that was almost entirely hidden in another colorful mural, this one depicting a handful of mermaids and nymphs who were swimming in a giant glass of wine. To be honest, Izzy hadn't spotted the door until Lola approached the mural and placed one of her hands on a particularly swollen-looking grape. That's when a shiny silver doorknob appeared before them. There was a guard inside the door, but he let the girls in without checking IDs or bags, and inside there were dozens of people ranging in the ages between 16 to 25. Some were dancing above a brightly lit dance floor, while others crowded the bar at the back of the club, and still more people hung out around the edges of the venue. They were seated in booths and around tables, laughing and playing one of the many games available to the patrons. "Over there!" Lola shouted to Izzy over the loud music. "Those are my friends." She grabbed Izzy's hand once more and swam over to a spacious booth with navy blue and padded seats where half a dozen people were drinking and laughing, while a deck of cards sat untouched on the table. Izzy and Lola joined them in good spirits and were quickly offered drinks and snacks. It wasn't long before they were laughing and talking like old friends. Lola's companions were happy and friendly people for the most part. They were thrilled to meet Lola's mysterious date, who she'd only met earlier that day, and Izzy tried her best to make a good first impression. She laughed at jokes, told funny anecdotes, and made sure to look at no one the way she looked at Lola. This seemed to help win over the group, and aside from one guy who seemed to criticize anything and everything he could, the youths had loads of fun discussing different forms of magic and exchanging stories of the adventures they'd had during their travels. Evidently, Lola and her friends were taking a gap year before diving deeper into their studies, a common rite of passage among young witches, and they had arrived in Atlantis after their cruise ship had mysteriously stopped in the middle of the ocean. Although Izzy never had enough proof to support her theory, she had a hunch that Lola and her friends had been the ones to cause their unscheduled stop. The drinks continued to flow without Izzy ever having to touch the bottle in her bag. When the conversation began to slow, they picked up the deck of cards and played a variety of games. Then, when even the games failed to keep the group entertained, they ventured onto the dance floor and joined the 24 other partygoers. Well, dance floor wasn't entirely accurate. It was more of a dance space, which stretched from the floor of the venue all the way to the ceiling, which was covered entirely in mirrors and brightly colored disco balls. The music scene in this modern club was more of a jazzy 60s theme, which felt sort of out of place to Izzy, but she and Lola had a blast trying to come up with underwater dance moves to match the beats. They watched the local mermaids and ocean nymphs mingle with the out-of-towners, and they reveled in judging the people who were getting way too out of hand. Lola's friend, for example, actually got thrown out when he got into a fight with one particularly buff-looking mermaid with frizzy yellow hair. Yet, in spite of all the fun Izzy was having, she couldn't help but to compare this wonderful night with one she'd experienced back in New York. Izzy had been having a pretty rough go of it lately and had sought refuge, company, and relief at the bottom of bottles and in the arms of strangers. To summarize, it had not been the best time of her life. Lucas, on the other hand, was deep in the throes of popularity and was steadily climbing the ladder of recognition and adoration, and in spite of Izzy's poor reputation as a deadbeat, they had both been invited to the same party. At first, all had seemed well. Lucas and his cool friends kept to themselves and enjoyed a variety of strange drugs, while Izzy kept to the dance floor, dancing and flirting with half a dozen people throughout the night. But then the next morning had arrived, and with it came a horrifying realization that Izzy had spent the night with the wrong stranger. That's when things really took a turn for the worse. Now, down here on the ocean floor, Izzy tried not to think about that night all those months ago. But it was hard not to make the comparisons. The dancing, the drinking, the people acting rowdy for no particular reason. Parties were parties, after all. And even in the aftermath of her biggest mistake, Izzy was still up to her old tricks. Still, Lola helped to keep her mind on the present rather than the past. With her shiny hair swirling like seaweed in the water, it was hard not to pay attention to her. The way she moved in the water as if she'd been born down here, and Izzy wondered if maybe Lola had some mermaid or sea nymph in her DNA. She looked so natural that it made Izzy feel like a sea urchin next to her. It hadn't taken Izzy long to learn that dancing is drastically different underwater than on land. Her legs and arms moved as if in slow motion, and she needed to use her entire body to really get into it, something her muscles did not appreciate, as they rarely got any exercise nowadays. When the girls eventually decided to take a break from the dancing, Izzy's extremities throbbed with pain and felt like they were going to fall off entirely, and Lola had developed a serious stomach cramp. "I can't believe you actually came tonight," Lola cried over the loud music as the two girls leaned against the bar waiting for their drinks. "I'm really glad you did." Izzy laughed a little. "Did you really think I wasn't gonna come?" "Maybe," Lola shrugged, her cheeks flushing a little. "It's not every day that the hottest girl in the restaurant agrees to go on a date that very same night." "Oh, a date, huh?" Izzy raised her eyebrows at her date, smirking playfully at the horrified look that sprung up on Lola's face. The girl probably didn't have a lot of experience dating if her assumptions about Izzy and tonight could be brought down with one innocuous comment. Izzy, on the other hand, was experienced enough to be able to tell platonic interest from romantic interest. She just couldn't help teasing her poor date. Izzy laughed a little. "Calm down," she told Lola in a casual tone. "I'm just kidding." "Don't do that!" Lola squealed nervously. She gave Izzy a playful smack on the arm, but Izzy didn't mind. She liked feeling Lola's hand on her skin, even if it was through the water, and had always enjoyed playing pranks on people. It eased the tension when things got too serious. Giggling at Lola's nervous expression, Izzy gave her blushing date a soft kiss on the cheek. This definitely did not help Lola's condition. She looked at Izzy with eyes that shone with longing, then wrapped her arms around Izzy's neck and pulled her into a passionate kiss that lasted for several blissful minutes. When Lola at last pulled away, she let out a delighted sigh and smiled at Izzy. "You can do that any time you'd like," Izzy told her with a wide grin. She could feel her heart thumping away in her chest, picking up its pace whenever Lola swam closer to her. But there was something else, too. Something in the back of Izzy's head, tearing her attention away from her lovely date and filling her mind with doubts. Something with long red hair and warm chocolate brown eyes. Izzy may be able to differentiate between romantic and platonic interest, but she'd also learned to separate love from lust. There existed a distinct contrast between the two, and it was an important one to recognize. Right now, Izzy could tell that Lola veered more toward the former, while Izzy herself leaned firmly toward the latter. She wasn't about to bring that up, though. Izzy had made that mistake before, and it had ended in a long and uncomfortable conversation Izzy never wanted to repeat. Instead, she brushed some of Lola's hair from her face and dazzled the girl with her best smile. Lola's eyes lit up as she gave a girlish giggle. She leaned in to deliver one more kiss before returning her attention to the water that had been delivered at some point during their embrace. Izzy thought this was an excellent idea, and downed her entire cup in one large gulp. But then she set her cup down on the counter, a grave frown spreading over her face. "What?" Lola asked, concern etched across her soft features. "What's wrong?" Izzy's gaze turned to Lola. "How can we be drinking water when we're underwater?" she asked, her voice deep with confusion and urgency. Lola broke out in hysterics. Tears formed in her eyes as she doubled over, her stomach cramps returning in a flash, and although Izzy still wanted to know the answer, she couldn't help but to laugh along at the sight of this adorable girl. When Lola at last calmed down, she took Izzy's hand and gave it a quick kiss. "You're new to magic, huh?" she simpered empathetically. "Is it that obvious?" Izzy grimaced. I'm only like 2 weeks into my studies. Lola looked genuinely surprised to hear this. Really? She asked. How'd that happen? Izzy's eyes grew wide with exasperation, and she gave a weary chuckle. It's a long story. Well, maybe you can tell me on our next date, Lola replied, biting her lower lip. Her hands reached out and casually adjusted Izzy's button down. Izzy pursed her lips in an attempt to keep her face straight, a word which could never be used to describe her sexuality, and she took a deep breath to clear her mind. She told herself to keep her mouth shut and simply enjoy the night, then abruptly caught the attention of the bartender. After ordering another round of drinks, Izzy turned back to Lola and swept her into another deep embrace. While she didn't know whether or not she and Lola would ever have a second date, Izzy was certain that she wanted to be with Lola on this particular night. The two girls soon returned to the table where they'd previously been sitting with Lola's friends, but the others were all still on the dance floor and weren't likely to return anytime soon. Enjoying their time alone, the pair chatted a little bit to get to know one another better. Lola had apparently been raised in a witch commune out west, so her family's situation was drastically different from Izzy's. Her parents were married, both witches, and she'd been studying creature care for 2 years already. Lola apparently wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, a detail which abruptly reminded Izzy of her conversation with Clement earlier that day. Lola also enjoyed many of the same books as Izzy, and they ended up talking about the Percy Jackson series for an embarrassingly long amount of time. What time is it? Izzy asked Lola when she returned to the table carrying their last round of drinks. Lola checked her phone as she handed Izzy her drink. 9:33, she replied. When do you have to leave? In like half an hour, Izzy muttered bitterly, raising her cup to her mouth. She wasn't exactly looking forward to going back to the others and facing the fact that she ditched them for a party. It felt like it had been a shitty thing to do, which was pretty weird. Both Bertie and Taya had been visibly excited for Izzy to go to the party, so why was Izzy so racked with guilt? She'd bailed on over a dozen family engagements back in New York for far less interesting events, and had never for a moment felt guilty about it. But this was different. She didn't want Bertie to realize what a disappointment Izzy was. At least, not yet. With a couple of deep gulps of her kelparita, a margarita-inspired drink made from kelp,
Heyo.
Izzy forced these thoughts from her head and told herself to just forget about it. She had a date to entertain, after all. She turned to Lola with a cheeky grin. I guess we should just make the best of the time we have left, Izzy stated with a decisive tone. Let's carpe this diem. Lola laughed again, her pleasant voice echoing through the water and making the hairs on Izzy's neck stand on high alert. Lola inched closer to her on the padded bench, letting her hand come to rest on Izzy's thigh. Sounds great, Lola purred with a playful wink. I know somewhere we can go that's a bit more private. As Izzy raised an intrigued eyebrow to her date, Lola got up from the booth and pulled Izzy along with her. They left the seating area, swam past the dance space, and toward the back of the club. Turning back to Izzy with a pair of bright eyes and slightly reddish cheeks, Lola led them onward and up a flight of stairs, and down a dimly lit corridor in the back of the venue. Izzy figured that Lola had probably visited this place before, since she clearly knew where she was going, but a part of her still worried that they were going somewhere they weren't supposed to be. What would Bertie say if Izzy returned to her in the company of a bunch of security guards, all because some cute girl had lured her into some illegal activity? Noticing Izzy's nerves, Lola shot her a reassuring smile. She gave Izzy's hand a soft squeeze, then opened a door at the end of the corridor and swam into a small studio apartment. What is this place? Izzy asked as she looked around the room. It was tiny in comparison to the Kingsley's apartment in New York, containing nothing but the bare necessities. A kitchen, which was attached to a meager living area. In the middle sat a perfectly made bed, and in front of it sat a large TV and a coffee table bearing a frequently used ashtray. It's the manager's place, Lola replied offhandedly. She's a buddy of mine. For a brief moment, Izzy hesitated. Had Lola been brought here by the manager? Was Izzy getting into some drama she didn't know about? But then she closed that line of thinking, turned to Lola, and set her eyes on the prize. Without preamble, she walked up to Lola and drew her in close, Izzy's hands falling to Lola's lower back as she leaned in and kissed her. Lola's breathing grew deeper and heavier as she began to tug at Izzy's shirt, which came off shortly thereafter, along with Lola's dress. Izzy brushed the long strands of auburn hair from her face and gave Lola a deep kiss before inching down her neck, her lips caressing Lola's skin as she moved along her shoulder and neck bone. Lola shivered at her touch, and this reaction only made Izzy feel ever more certain of what she wanted from tonight. Taking Lola's hand in hers, Izzy led them over to the bed that stood waiting and kissed her again. Running her hands down Lola's back, Izzy let her kisses wander from her freckled shoulder across her chest and down past her stomach. When Lola's fingers twirled into Izzy's hair and grabbed a hold of her curls, Izzy got back up and pushed the girl firmly onto the bed. A dusky sort of light filled the room when Izzy was pulling her shirt back on. She knew that she should feel nice and relaxed after all the fun she and Lola had, but now her head felt clearer than ever, and all she could think about was getting back to Taya's apartment on time. She wanted to apologize to Lola for having to leave so abruptly, but that voice in the back of her head told her that it was pointless. Lola had known from the get-go that Izzy only had a limited amount of time, so why bother bringing it up? Besides, this was Lola. It wasn't some idiotic chick she'd hooked up with at a random party in Brooklyn. Lola was oblivious to all of Izzy's conflicting thoughts and emotions, of course. She was stretching out comfortably in the bed, still covered by the club manager's blanket. She looked sort of like a cat where she laid, her bare stomach facing the ceiling above them, and her arms draped over the edge of the bed. Izzy felt a little bad about the mess she was leaving in the manager's apartment, and she hoped that Lola would tidy up a bit before heading out. "It sucks that you have to leave so soon," Lola pouted from her pillow. "I know," Izzy nodded, avoiding Lola's eyes. She was exhausted and pretty drunk, and everything she'd been repressing since lunch had since returned with a vengeance. Her anger at Clement, her guilt at bailing on Bertie and Taya, her memories from her old life in Manhattan. Izzy really just wanted to get out of there and get back home. Keeping her face hidden, she pulled her boots back on and laced them up, her fingers trembling slightly under the strain of the laces. "I'm going to miss you," Lola sighed, a little too earnestly. Regret tugged at Izzy's heart as she looked up at the girl and shot her a warm smile. Then she crawled onto the bed with her and gave Lola another kiss. "We'll always have Atlantis," she said in her corniest voice, and Lola giggled. "Do you have any cigarettes?" A handful of minutes later, Izzy was leaving the club with half a pack of Camel Blues and a Zippo lighter that worked underwater. A gift from Lola. She was a sweet girl, and Izzy really did wish that they could have had some more time together. But she only had 20 minutes to get back to the apartment, and she wasn't totally sure where she was going. The cigarette burned slowly and inexplicably between Izzy's fingers as she swam down the street she was sure Lola had led her down a few hours earlier, but which now looked totally unfamiliar. The crowds of people had disappeared once more, and all that remained were a desolate set of buildings which rose high above her like the skyscrapers of Izzy's hometown. When panic threatened to set in, Izzy decided to take a brief break. She paused next to an expansive and bright green apartment building, taking a few deep drags from her cigarette as she looked around. Izzy knew that there was a better way to get back, but her brain was fighting against her. It was too wrapped up in nights long since past, and didn't at all want to focus on getting back to Bertie and Taya and Sam. Sam. In a flash, Izzy remembered the brief time she and Sam had shared alone, earlier that morning. They'd been waiting for Bertie to arrive, and Sam was just about to enchant Izzy's cell phone to repel water so that it could survive their trip to Atlantis. They'd been standing in front of the closet with the trunk, although Izzy hadn't known it at the time, and Sam had been telling her about a spell to find her way back to them in case she got lost. According to Sam, it was a common choice for a first spell in archaeology studies because of how simple it was. You just channel your magical energy into a ball of light in your hands, mumble a prayer to the goddess to guide you on your journey, and the ball leads the way. Fuck, Izzy mumbled to herself as she realized that the half-gone cigarette she was holding was going to get in the way of the spell. She'd need both hands for it. In order to give herself some more quality time with a death stick, Izzy decided to try the spell when she got to the end of the block. She could probably make it that far on her own. As Izzy reached the end of the block, she decided that it was time to put out her cigarette and test out this tracker spell. But then she found herself facing the strange problem of not knowing how to do so. She thought about putting the cigarette out on a nearby building, but they were all so bright and clean that a burn mark would surely stick out like a sore thumb. Glancing around her to make sure that she was still alone, Izzy decided to just drop it. It's not like it can catch anything on fire in the ocean, right? Well, Izzy was right. As soon as her fingers released their grip on the cigarette, it became drenched and proceeded to float miserably in front of her face. Working quickly now, Izzy scooped the sad lump of paper and fuzz up and buried it beneath some sand on the ocean floor, hoping that this was better than simply letting it float forever in the ocean. Then she straightened up, focused her mind and her energy, and attempted the spell. It didn't work the first time, nor the second. Simple, my ass, Izzy swore under her breath. In spite of Bertie and Sam's encouraging words back at Taya's apartment, Izzy couldn't get over the fact that magic never seemed to work with her. It always fought back, straining against her energy like a wild horse refusing to be bound or controlled by anyone or anything. With her third attempt, however, Izzy actually managed to produce a little electric ball of energy. Gasping with amazement at her own talent, Izzy felt her heart drop as the ball of light died before her eyes. But she knew she could do it now. Suffocating her doubts, Izzy closed her eyes and thought of nothing but Bertie and Sam. Their faces, their voices, and what Izzy would do when she saw them again. "Please help me get back to them," she whispered into the still night. "I want to apologize to Bertie for not making an effort when I knew how important this was to her. I know she said it was fine, but it's not. Please, just help me find my way back." When Izzy opened her eyes again, the ball of energy had already started to speed away from her, bobbing up and down as it ventured onward between the colorful buildings. Realizing that her very first spell was about to escape from sight, Izzy tore off after it. She had to dig deep down for her very last bit of energy just to catch up with the electric ball, but the closer she got to it, the faster the spell seemed to travel. When the witchling finally turned up outside Taya's apartment, her legs and arms felt like they were made of jelly rather than blood and bones, and she only had 2 minutes to spare. "Wow, perfect timing!" Bertie smiled broadly at Izzy, her wrinkled face flushed and her eyes slightly bloodshot. "Did you have a good time?" Izzy couldn't help but to chuckle in spite of her exhaustion. It looked like she was not the only one who'd imbibed heavily that evening. Taya and Bertie were both wobbling significantly more than usual, and their rowdy laughter had echoed all the way to the end of the block. Sam was leaned up against Taya's apartment, reminding Izzy of a cool kid from a 90s movie. "Yeah, the party was great," Izzy confirmed in between ragged breaths. "Was that a tracker spell I just saw?" Taya asked, pointing at the spot where the ball of energy had been a few seconds earlier before vanishing into thin, water. Izzy nodded, doubling over to help steady her breathing. "And you've only been studying magic for a week?" Taya shot Izzy an impressed look as the girl nodded once more. "Did you teach her that, Sam?" Bertie asked with a frown. Sam shrugged. "I figured she'd get lost at one point or another," they explained casually. Then they turned an amused pair of eyes to their cousin. "Although I didn't think she'd need it on the very first day. Or that she'd be able to do it, for that matter." Izzy regarded them all with a somewhat offended expression. Hadn't they all just been saying that she'd been doing so well in her studies? Why was it so unexpected that she'd be able to do it? But then she conceded that they had a point. She actually had gotten lost on her first day, and she almost hadn't been able to do the spell. "Well, kids, let's get going," Bertie said with a clap of her hands. She turned to Taya and gave her a hug, telling the old woman to call her the following day. Sam was next in line, giving their Auntie Taya a big hug goodbye, and then Izzy swam up to the old woman. "I'm really sorry I didn't spend the rest of the evening with you," she told Taya soberly, her face falling into an involuntary scowl. "I hope we can come back sometime soon, and I promise I'll listen to any story or expertise you have, because I really do want to learn this stuff. And, well, you're really cool." Taya put a soft hand under her chin and gave Izzy a twinkly-eyed smile. "You are a sweet and talented girl," she told Izzy in a coarse voice. "We will meet again, I'm certain. Now take care of your grandmother for me, okay?" Izzy accepted this responsibility with a sheepish smile and gave Taya a hug. Then she turned around and joined Birdie and Sam, who waited a few respectful feet away. Just like last time, Sam towed their relatives toward the surface of the Atlantic Ocean with mind-blowing speeds. Fortunately, Tom's potion also seemed to prevent decompression sickness. Yet, even though Sam was the one doing all the hard work, Izzy felt completely drained after the extraordinarily long day. All she wanted to do was fall into her bed and pass out. The Raven trio had arrived back on the island with mere seconds to spare, but they made it all the same. The magical vortex with its powerful purple winds appeared right on time and picked them all up, swallowing them whole and setting the trio plummeting into darkness. Once it had spat them back through the open door and into the hallway outside the trunk closet, the trunk lid snapped shut and the door to the closet closed with a loud bang. Sam and Birdie were standing up, chatting about their evening with Taya, but the landing had once again thrown Izzy off balance. She ended up on the floor with several sore spots on her butt and legs, but it was comforting to know that they were home at last. For a moment, Izzy thought she'd heard the clink of the vodka bottle she was still carrying in her bag, but when she glanced up to see if her family members had heard it, neither Sam or Birdie made any sign that they had. They just continued to chat pleasantly. Getting to her feet with extreme care, Izzy fought hard to appear as sober as possible, which was difficult after traveling through a magical vortex, several drinks, and much dancing, all of which took place underwater. She felt wildly off balance, and she wondered silently how Birdie and Sam did it so easily. They both looked as happy and steady as they had in Atlantis, although Sam was part mermaid, so Izzy supposed that made some sense. "Well, kids, I'll see you in the morning," Birdie said after a couple of minutes, stifling a yawn. "Be prepared to get sweaty and bruised tomorrow. You'll be practicing battle magic." Izzy let a tiny moan escape her throat. She'd completely forgotten what they'd be doing tomorrow, and now she'd have to do it while nursing a hangover. Perfect. Birdie gave both of her grandchildren a kiss on the cheek before turning and disappearing down the corridor, Sam and Izzy lingering behind to walk the path to their bedrooms alone. "So," Sam spoke up once Birdie was gone, "how was the party?" Izzy mumbled, shrugging absent-mindedly. "It was fine. Kind of exhausting. Lots of people and lots of dancing. And lots of alcohol," Sam filled in for her. "I don't think she heard the bottle in your bag, by the way, but I'd keep it hidden if I were you." "I thought you said Birdie is fine with that stuff," Izzy asked, frowning at her cousin. "Oh no, she is," Sam replied at once, but then a wide grin spread across their face. "Birdie just really likes vodka." Izzy snorted tiredly. "I've always wondered where I got it from," she mumbled, shaking her head. "Clement prefers whiskey, which I hate, and I never knew what Mom preferred." "Vodka and gin rule this family," Sam nodded importantly. "So, how was the girl?" Izzy's eyes narrowed as she shot her cousin a half-hearted glare. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied in a curt voice. "Besides, a lady never kisses and tells." "Your shirt begs to differ." Looking down, Izzy instantly spotted that she'd put her top on inside out. She pouted a little as her cheeks grew heated. "She was sweet," Izzy admitted begrudgingly, too tired to be witty. "I actually think you would have liked her." "I don't like anyone," Sam argued, "and most people feel the same way about me." "I don't get that," Izzy replied with a frown. She shook her head, which turned out to be a mistake as the corridor swayed dangerously ahead of her. She had to stop and grab the wall for support, blinking until the world righted itself. "What don't you get?" Sam followed up, once Izzy was steady, watching her with mild amusement and very little concern. "You say that people don't like you," Izzy responded, resuming their walk. "I don't get that. You're really smart and good at magic, and you're cooler than pretty much everyone I know. I mean, aside from myself, obviously." "Maybe they sense that I don't like them," Sam pointed out. "But why don't you like them?" Izzy pressed. "I didn't honestly think that you could get any more intrusive than you already were," Sam mumbled, a hint of annoyance in their voice, but Izzy ignored it and poked them in the side. "Tell me," she goaded them. "I don't like people because most of them suck," Sam groaned dramatically. "Well, yeah!" Izzy threw her hands up as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "We all suck! But if you avoid everyone, then you'll miss out on the ones that suck a little bit less. The ones you'll actually enjoy being around. Like the party girl? Sam asked with a skeptical yet amused look. Izzy chuckled a little as her face took on an even deeper shade of red. Yeah, like the party girl, she agreed. I'm not saying that I'm gonna marry her, or even that I'm gonna call her again. Wow, charming. Shut up. Izzy gave Sam a smack on the arm and continued. I may never see her again, but I'm still glad that I got the chance to meet her. Well, Sam heaved a sigh. If you ever find someone that you actually want to keep around for a while, I promise I'll at least say hello. Aww. Izzy grinned and wrapped her arms around her squirming cousin, and the two continued to walk back to their bedrooms like that. Sam tried to escape their cousin's arms, but they weren't quite as fast on land as in the water, and Izzy didn't have to try hard to catch them again. It felt warm and comfortable to be back in the Raven Mansion. Once the teens at last appeared at the strange paintings that contained their hidden bedrooms, Izzy apologized to Sam for ditching them that night, and promised that she would never again leave one of their archaeology trips for some cute girl. A goddess? Maybe. Sam, although they appreciated the sentiment, never gave a shit in the first place and just shrugged and told her goodnight. Even so, the apology made Izzy feel better, and it certainly helped her to fall asleep that night. And that was the date!
That's the end of the chapter?
That's the end of the chapter!
Oh my gosh!
Yeah!
That one was so fun. I totally called that they were gonna hook up and everything. Oh my gosh.
I honestly don't even remember you calling that. It's been so long.
Oh, no, I did it in my head. So don't...
Okay, well, yeah, that checks out.
I think maybe in the last episode I said, oh, they're totally gonna hook up. Or they're totally gonna have sex.
Actually, yeah, I think you're right. I think you did say that.
I might have. I don't know.
But yeah. Wild party.
Wild party. I loved it though. That was so fun. And then she woke up and she don't go. I know I don't want to go, but I gotta go. Oh man, I feel bad because I totally ditched out on my family there. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, very much. And hopefully it's not going to be like a month until the next episode.
So yeah, please subscribe. Come back next time. It's just gonna keep going. Yeah. We have so much to go through at this point. We're like three-quarters of the way through the first book, and there's 3 of them. So
well, to be fair, we're like almost halfway through the first book.
We're almost halfway.
Actually, maybe you're right. Maybe it is closer to 3/4.
Well, let's get it out. What chapters do we have? We've changed since the last time that you have viewed in. We have some new chapters. I see at least 2 new chapters.
Here's the date, and then we have the reconciliation, the shifter, the ceremony, the past, the visit, the field trip, the winter solstice, the 17th precinct, and then 3 more chapters, which are yet to be named.
Yeah, we are not even halfway through this book. So
not quite.
There's plenty more to go. We're having lots of fun. Come back and see us.
You haven't even met some of the main characters yet.
Yeah.
You haven't gotten into the... Ooh, there is a big old character you have barely even begun to learn about.
Well, I am looking forward to it. I know you're looking forward to it too.
Yeah, it should be.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. It would help to grow this whole thing and get more people listening to her book, which, I mean, obviously is the best work of literature ever produced.
Yeah, thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. And unlike Victorious, which suddenly got cut off in the middle of a season, we will see you next time.